All right. Well, this is Nick Redding. I'm the Executive Director of Preservation Maryland, and good evening, everyone. We're very excited for those members who are able to join us tonight, and our friends, colleagues, supporters, Facebook fans. It's great to have you here tonight, and we're thrilled to be joined by Jared Frederick, who is a scholar, historian. I knew him as a park ranger, and we're going to be talking about the 76th anniversary of D-Day, which started at this moment almost 76 years ago. And so it's a pleasure to have you with us tonight, Jared. Thank you for joining us. Where are we talking to you from right now?
My background is the SHAFE headquarters in Portsmouth. And in the days before telecommunications and the big board, as they like to call it today, they used pins and pegs to document the progress of the Allied armies in Normandy. And the room is by and large a time capsule, as it was seen in 1944, and visitors can go and see it in Portsmouth, England. And I thought there was no better backdrop to have for our conversation tonight.
Well, I'm just in my Knotty Pine office, but not onto like something that maybe the general would have enjoyed back in his Gettysburg time.
I think most definitely he would have.
So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But by way of introduction, I should give you Jared's official bio. So he's an instructor of history at Penn State Altoona. And he's previously, as I mentioned, worked as a park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park. He is the author of numerous books, one of which we have linked in here. And I have my trusty copy here right next to me, Dispatches from D-Day, Dispatches of D-Day, I should say, A People's History of the Normandy Invasion. And it's a fantastic book. We're going to talk a little bit about it, but it really tackles and looks at D-Day from a different perspective. I think a lot of people get caught up perhaps in the tactics and the history of D-Day unfolding and blow by blow, and Omaha and Utah and Sword and Juneau. And I think that it really puts a much more personal spin on the battle and the war itself, and how the American press dealt with D-Day, how the American people dealt with it, people living here. And so really a fantastic read. This is not a sales pitch, but it might as well be, because it's really quite good. But Jared and I said, and I'm not going to do all the talking, but we were talking in advance, and we said that perhaps to set the stage and to frame this conversation, we would start with perhaps one of the most famous pieces of written military address, certainly in American history, perhaps in world history, which is General Dwight D. Eisenhower's Order of the Day, which was provided to troops as they were making, or rather prior to them making the assault. So I thought I would read that, and then we're going to jump into some questions and really have a great conversation here with Jared, if that sounds good to everybody. So it starts: soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you were about to embark upon the great crusade towards which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on various fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 40-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munition of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together in victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. So hard to top that, Jared. But that really kind of gives you a sense for how powerful a moment this is. And we're unquestionably living through some pretty profound and significant times of our own. The pandemic, this tragic civil unrest brought about by the murder of George Floyd. But if we cast our eyes and our minds back 76 years, we find ourselves at another pivotal and significant and transformative turning point in history. So to set that stage and to talk a little bit about that, let's learn a little bit more about you, so that we know, and so that the listeners and watchers here know who you are. What's your upbringing? Why does a guy like you have this interest, and your interest in World War II and D-Day specifically?
Yeah, and as is the case with many historians, there's really no simple way to answer that. I guess one way of beginning to reflect on that is a bunch of historical movies when I was, younger. The movie Gettysburg was the bug that bit me, that got me into history. And I would say I have a dual affinity for the study of both the Civil War and the Second World War. Because they are America's two most transformative wars, and some historians have gone as far as to say they're America's only two absolutely necessary wars. And so there's this inherent drama behind them that even as a 7 or 8 year old, I was able to connect to. I guess one of the first visualizations of D-Day that I had was the 1962 movie The Longest Day, and I suspect that that's true for many of them. That was a perennial favorite for Memorial Day and Veterans Day. It still is, airs on a number of television channels. And then I slowly began to realize that one of my grandfathers, a man who I hardly knew, he passed away when I was 5 years old, had participated in the Normandy Invasion. And my grandfather was among some of the first American troops to go ashore on Utah Beach with the 4th Infantry Division. And so between kind of popular consciousness and these very profound family connections, that really spurred me forward into middle school, high school, college, and beyond.
Yeah, and you've carried it on. I interviewed Tim, a historian, recently, and he said you don't want to become a one war wonder, which I think is something that a historian at Penn State coined. And you certainly aren't that, because you've published on Gettysburg and the Civil War. Now, did you have Civil War ancestors as well? Was there a connection there?
I did, yeah, several dozen of them, as best as I can tell. So there was of course, I didn't know them, so the connection wasn't quite as significant. But nonetheless, family history and using that as a stepping stone can be a really powerful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I know it was for me personally. I had a Civil War ancestor that we thought was a great hero. We could do a whole separate Zoom on him. He turned out to be a tremendous thief who was a bounty jumper and then applied for multiple pensions.
That story's just as good.
Yeah, actually, it's almost better. I mean, but be that as it may, let's dive into D-Day. So you've got this familial connection. So this is personal to you, as do I. In fact, I guess I should have mentioned this up front, but I'm actually named after one of my ancestors who was shot in the leg on D-Day. So he was with the Canadians. But let's talk a little bit about D-Day and really try and put it in context for people. Maybe people just casually interested in Preservation Maryland and Maryland history and history in general, who are listening in tonight, who may not understand sort of the context of where D-Day falls. When does it happen within World War II? And what are the stakes for success? Like, if they don't succeed on D-Day, what could potentially happen?
Yeah, I think a good foundation for our discussion is to quickly circle back to General Eisenhower's order of the day, the speech that you read at the outset of our program tonight, because in my mind, that is as important to understanding the Normandy Invasion as is the Gettysburg Address and understanding the 1863 battle. And Eisenhower, having been stationed in Gettysburg, having been a student of history, I have no doubt that he had a copy of the Gettysburg Address by his side as he was writing that. And they use and intone a lot of the same moral rhetoric. They are roughly the same length. And by and large, they convey the same message that we are involved in this great struggle. It's a struggle for a vast future, and the consequences of losing it are too bitter to contemplate. And so I think that really puts it into perspective. To get into the finer details of it all, D-Day takes place in the final year of the Second World War. In hindsight, it is perceived as the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany. People in 1944 didn't know that, though. They hoped that would be the case. But in 1944, victory was certainly not a foregone conclusion, because if the invasion failed, there was really no other option but to have to try and do it again, maybe a year or two down the road.
I feel like that's one of the great challenges of history and reading and writing about history is remembering that we see these things as foregone conclusions, right? Gettysburg is a turning point, and you know, the South will never be at that apex again. D-Day is a turning point, and you know, it's the beginning of the end. But you're right, and I think it's important to remember that and to put that in context, that those troops going in on the beaches or the landing strips, they had no sense for that. I mean, it was not a foregone conclusion. And to Eisenhower's point in the speech, you know, the enemy is well equipped and battle hardened.
And tying in with that, what people did not realize until several decades after the fact is that Eisenhower penned a supplemental speech to his better known Order of the Day. And in it, and luckily it never went past the draft phase, but he penned a statement that would go to the press that said, "I take full responsibility for this operation failing." And I think it goes to show how forthright and how honest of a leader he was.
Right.
Because good leaders don't just take the limelight for success, they also accept the responsibility for failure or defeat. Eisenhower certainly realized that. And luckily that speech was never released to the press. But one of the more interesting things about it is at the very end, he dates it. And instead of putting June 5th, he puts July 5th. He puts down the wrong month. And I like to think that that's a brief little window of insight into his emotional standing at that moment.
Right.
It's such a nerve-wracking moment for him that he puts the wrong month on a letter.
It's interesting. So, I mean, as you say, I mean, the stakes for success are high. Going into this, do the Allies feel like they have a real shot at winning? Do they expect to succeed? What are the expectations of success?
There is an expectation for success. The problem is that they aren't certain what the cost of it will be. Certainly, the United States realizes that along with the other allied nations, that it has the upper leg over Nazi Germany. And really, the broad strategy that was used was one of quantity over quality. You know, the Germans had better tanks, they had better planes, they had machine guns that could shoot more rounds per minute than what the Americans did. But Americans could produce more of all of that. And they had not been in the war as long as Germany had. And as Hap Arnold, the Air Force's chief at this time, said, you know, it's a matter of both sides digging to the bottom of the barrel. And the Germans are going to hit the bottom before we do. And that's how we're going to win this thing.
Right. Right. And to your point about sort of like the German quality, I mean, it was always these, and it was a lot of propaganda, but sort of this German idea that, well, we'll have these jets or these, this magical gun, or we'll have, I mean, and they sort of pegged their reality on, well, we may not have a lot of this stuff, but at some point we're going to have a jet, or we're going to have an atomic bomb, or we're going to have all these crazy things. And they kind of dangled that propaganda in front of the Wehrmacht, throughout the war until the bitter end. So there was almost a sense of reality on their part too. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think this gets to one of the core elements of my book. And that's the fact that American service members, as well as generals like Eisenhower, believed in the freedom of the press, access to information, a certain degree of transparency. Eisenhower couldn't always tell the truth, but he did his best not to lie. And those are two very important, points of separation there. The secrecy and the exigencies of war didn't always allow him to be transparent, but whenever possible, he tried to be open and honest with the reporters who worked daily in his headquarters. And one reason why the press was so important during World War II, and many soldiers wrote about this, is that was one of the core things that separated them from the enemy.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're talking, just as a recap for people who are joining us, with historian, scholar, former park ranger Jared Frederick, about the 76th anniversary here as we approach of D-Day. At this time, and maybe we'll do a little on this moment in a second here about what actually is transpiring in the fields of the bocage around Normandy. But we're talking with Jared Frederick, and he just mentioned his book, which I've just so happened to have a great copy of right here. And there's a link to it here if you'd like to pick up a copy, Dispatches of D-Day. And there's a tremendous amount of material in there about the free press and about how soldiers were reading this. And you got a great bit in there about the soldier who dives into the foxhole and realizes he's next to a reporter and just wants to shake his hand, and really paint a picture of what a critical role that is. And, in a time where we're seeing the press under assault all across the globe, it's important to remember that this was a critical component of America's fight against tyranny and Nazi fascism in the 20th century. So we've talked a little bit about the book, but maybe we'll dive into the book a little bit and kind of some of the stories that it tells broadly. Maybe you could paint a picture for people who are listening of the mood of the nation as D-Day is approaching, and you really kind of get into some of that zeitgeist of America in the book, and how Americans learn that the invasion has begun.
So to kind of paint a picture of America in the spring of 1944, absolutely everybody knew this was coming. They just didn't know when. And so in several towns across America, and even some newspapers facilitated this, they had contests, like guess when D-Day is going to take place. And you'd get a year's free subscription to the newspaper for whoever was closest to it. I mean, it sounds kind of macabre and insincere when you think about it. But this sort of speculation was in the realm of everyday life. And people were kind of emotionally hanging on by their fingernails, waiting for this huge pivotal moment that only perhaps, a dozen or so people in the whole world knew when it was going to take place, or roughly when it was going to take place.
Which, by the way, not to interrupt you here, but is phenomenal that only a handful of people actually know, and that they actually seemingly are able to keep it a secret. I mean, there's obviously some leaks here and there, and we know about them in retrospect, but they didn't really make a huge difference. But just fascinating. I mean, that's a whole other side of this, but fascinating that they were able to keep an operation this large. I mean, you're talking about like what, 150,000 people engaged, and somehow they're all in the dark.
Yeah, and
I mean,
certainly people in Great Britain had a better sense of mobilization than what people elsewhere did, since England was the staging ground, because you know, in the early morning hours when entire camps disappear and entire ports empty.
Yeah, something's happening.
Yeah, British people were up early on the morning of June 6th with their radios on, waiting for word of it in some cases.
Wow. Okay.
So,
but until that moment, they didn't really know. It's not like they had a week's notice. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, and there's so many great stories along those lines when people find out. Mamie Eisenhower being one of them. And it just goes to show what a consummate professional Eisenhower was, because she was attending the graduation ceremony of her son from West Point. And Eisenhower's son, John, graduated from West Point on D-Day, one of the great coincidences of history. And a reporter called her at something like 4 a.m. And he said, you know, the invasion, it's on. And she said, oh, I had no idea. And, you know, and there was this kind of comical banter between her and this reporter about her being completely caught off guard by it. So that's just one of many interesting stories of when people first found out about it.
Right. So are there parallels to how we learn about events today? I mean, how different was it for people then?
My answer could change in years to come, but as I'm sitting here in the moment, I would say that it's a substantially different experience, how people get news and how they interact with it today versus back then. Because in 1944, you have literally only 3 means of getting news. That's the radio, the newspaper, and newsreels that you have to go to the movie theater to see. And so news is a lot more disseminated through many more varieties of medium today. And of course, there are many different kinds of medium within the internet alone. And, you know, I think the argument or the summary is yet to be seen on whether or not that is good for democracy or not. Because, you know, as we've seen with recent events, you know, we kind of see the dismantling of common held truths and assumptions, and, you know, people can have their own version of the truth, and they may never be exposed to other versions of it, and so on and so forth. So whether or not you think that's a good or a bad thing, it was something very substantially different in 1944, as was the way in which Americans perceived the press. Americans at the time perceived the press as all that was good and wholesome and singularly unique about the American way of life and how we attain information and educate ourselves. And of course, many people do not see it that way today.
Right. Yeah, that has shifted dramatically from, you know, the story that you paint in your book. Speaking to the experience of Marylanders, you're talking with Preservation Maryland right now, and, you know, we did a post, I think, yesterday about the B-26 and the bombers that helped clear the way for D-Day, built right here in Maryland. But perhaps you could take a step aside for a moment and talk about maybe where Marylanders served during the invasion, what kind of combat they saw, and perhaps any examples you'd want to highlight, and talk a little bit about the Marylanders there.
There are several Marylanders featured in my book, and my book it looks at both the home front and the battlefront simultaneously, and on and off. And so in certain cases, I looked at what was happening in some Maryland communities, and then there were also stories of certain Marylanders who were in the thick of fighting as well. And so I'll start off with a fun anecdote. And that's what happened in Maryland, or in Baltimore specifically, on D-Day. Because something that emerged a lot in the press at the time was, you know, how do we as a society respond to news of the invasion? Do we throw a party? Do we have a commemoration? Do we have church services? Do we work an extra shift at the factory? All of these conversations were being had in hometown newspapers. And so in Baltimore, it was decided that all of the liquor stores would be closed on D-Day. And quite naturally, that upset some of the fine citizens of Baltimore who wanted to have a more jubilant approach to news of the invasion. And they ended up going to their favorite corner liquor store and were gravely disappointed to find out that they couldn't get, the whiskey or bourbon that they so desired to celebrate with it.
Yeah, not the best choice for how to ring in D-Day.
Well, that was open to one's own interpretation at the time.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people saw this as the beginning of the end, and they hoped that that was something worth celebrating.
Right, right.
I don't think most people approached it that way. Churches were opened up, ball games were canceled, so on and so forth. So that's one kind of fun Maryland story that's a little bit more on the lighthearted side amidst all of this. But also on the home front, there was the wife of a Coast Guardsman by the name of Ruth Harvey, and she and her husband lived in Glen Burnie, Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
And her husband, John, was in the Coast Guard and was a D-Day participant. A lot of people don't realize how pivotal a role the Coast Guard played
Absolutely.
in the invasion. Hundreds of ships from the Coast Guard were involved as transport vessels and whatnot. And her husband was rescuing soldiers and sailors out of the water, and eventually the news of this became garbled somehow, and how it appeared to her in a telegram was that her husband's ship was sunk. In actuality, he was rescuing people from sunken vessels. And so she was very surprised to get a letter from him saying that everything was fine. And she wrote back, "Why didn't you tell me about your ship being sunk?"
Right.
And so this was exceedingly difficult to do in the days before Skype and Facebook and cell phones.
Right.
Trying to have this transatlantic conversation about how you're alive and your ship wasn't sunk.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't want to get a Dear John letter as a result of all of that either.
Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, the other that I imagine you bring up, but I mean, a large number of the 29th Division came out of Maryland as well, right? In the blue and gray. And so, and they see some of the, do you want to talk a little bit maybe about where the 29th fought?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I have two soldiers from the 29th I was going to bring up next, and both of them were from Frederick, Maryland.
There you go.
And one of them was a gentleman by the name of William Mask. And I have, and both of these gentlemen who I'm going to discuss, they sent letters home, and as was often the case, family members would then send letters to the newspapers. And so that's the whole premise of my book, is I have all these first-person accounts that haven't seen the light of day since 1944, and it's an incredible untapped resource among historians in this age of digital history, and it's a wonderful stuff. But William Mask wrote home to Frederick. He said, "I lost my equipment, and when I hit the shore, I had nothing to fight with. The Germans had covered us with murderous machine gun crossfire, and most of my company was casualties before they got ashore. I crawled 50 yards until I was hit." And he eventually got a piece of shrapnel in the thumb, very lucky in contrast to some others.
Wow.
It was apparently serious enough that he was evacuated from the beach and received medical care. There's another soldier from Frederick by the name of Victor Wingate, and he also wrote home, and he wrote a very evocative letter home, not necessarily about combat, but about the aftermath and what he saw on Omaha Beach as the smoke was clearing. And he said, "American boys looked into merciless muzzles, belching Nazi venom. Scattered among the machines of war are many abandoned personal items that historians should not fail to capture when they paint this picture for future Americans to view." And I found that so evocative and poetic. And
Yeah, it was like he was giving you orders, Jared.
yeah, truly. And what makes it so interesting is that Ernie Pyle, the famous combat correspondent, who's later killed in the war, he writes a very in-depth article about that very thing. And he talks about all the toothbrushes and razor blades and eyeglasses and diaries and journals with empty pages that would never be filled. And this human litter that was all over the beach. And he wasn't talking about the bodies. He was talking about these tangible personal items that were representative of people who had been killed or wounded on the beach. And so it's so interesting that this soldier from Frederick, Maryland was channeling those same sorts of thoughts as he was considering what will history say about this moment and what should future historians think about when they write about this.
Yeah, and I feel like it's just like that critical and again, just fantastic part of the book that really captures that human side of all of this and sort of detaches itself maybe from the strategy and big picture, which is important, but to really zero in on the lives of these people. And I feel like in those moments, and if you read military history, you get a sense for this, not only in World War II, but I can think of examples in the Civil War where soldiers really focus in on these strange little, human aspects that they're seeing amidst just total carnage and almost how out of place it is.
Yeah.
And how it kind of reminds them of their humanity. I know in the Civil War, they talk about, seeing dead horses and dead animals and how that's almost harder to see than a dead human. And just sort of like that humanity of it all. And that, and all of that would have been lost, but for, and I don't think we mentioned it, but you transcribed something like 300,000 words of newspaper articles. Your fingers must be permanently yellow.
Yeah. But, in addition to these firsthand accounts found in newspapers as such, there are also very insightful columns that are done by war correspondents. And the Baltimore Sun had an international war correspondent by the name of Holbrook Bradley.
Yep.
Who covered the invasion as well. And a lot of his stuff is just as evocative as the better known Ernie Pyle. And a snippet of what he had to say about combat on the beach. He said, "Those first few hours on the beach must have been living hell. And we saw there had been no discrimination in the way men fell. For the 2 bars of captains were among the many plain uniforms of the privates." And so, he too, just very eloquently painted this picture of, it doesn't matter what rank you are, if you're on that beach, it is a very lethal place to find oneself.
Yeah, we have a little information on our website about Holbrook, and the Baltimore Sun has done a significant amount of work on him. That institution, that paper had a long history of putting reporters in the field with the troops, and gives you a very different perspective, and kind of back to that whole freedom of the press thing, and having the press right there along with them. So since it is June 5th and we are broadcasting live here on Facebook, again, I'm Nick Redding. I'm the Executive Director of Preservation Maryland, if you just joined us, and I'm here with Jared Frederick, a historian, scholar, author, former ranger, cartoonist. We didn't get into that, but he's like an Ernie Pyle unto himself. We're talking live now. So if it's 76 years ago, it's 1944, and it's this moment somewhere, I guess, east of the beaches. What is happening in Normandy right now?
All hell is breaking loose 76 years ago right now, behind the Normandy beachhead. And beginning around midnight, but really heating up around 1:15 or 1:30 in the morning. And that's right now because France is 6 hours ahead of us here on the east coast of the United States. So it's 1:35 over there right now. And this moment is when the Germans begin to realize that there are enemy troops landing from the skies in vast numbers. And it was determined that a lot of the American and British and Canadian and French paratroopers were to start landing behind the beaches around 1:20 in the morning on June 6th. And that time was deliberately chosen because that is when the moon peaked. The moon would be the highest in the sky that it would be that night. And when you're jumping from an airplane at 500 feet into almost pitch black darkness, having a little bit of extra natural illumination certainly helps you get your bearings. And so that is why at that hour, a lot of the paratroopers began to land in earnest.
Mm-hmm.
Their objective, their overarching objective, was to disrupt communications, raise a little hell, create some chaos, have the Germans looking over their shoulders, and ultimately pave the way for the larger amphibious landings on the beaches that were to commence a short 5 hours down the road, 5 hours into the future. And so, the paratroopers are glamorized a lot, rightfully so, because it was an incredibly dangerous proposition in which to find oneself.
And Band of Brothers didn't hurt their image.
Surely. But what is often forgotten is that the paratroopers and the amphibious troops are completely dependent on one another, because
right,
without one, the other one cannot succeed. If the paratroopers don't help pave the way, then German resistance is going to be fiercer on the beaches. And if the beach landings don't succeed, then the paratroopers become sacrificial lambs, and there's no way for them to get away from the Nazi-occupied continent. So high stakes indeed.
Yeah, and would you say that, I mean, what's the well, two questions, I guess. The impact of the operation, does the paratrooping component work? I mean, there's different aspects of the operation. We can't talk about all of them tonight, but obviously there's trouble with the naval bombardment. Doesn't hit all the places it's supposed to hit on all the beaches. There's trouble with the aerial bombardment because of smoke, and they're scared that they don't want to bomb their own guys, so they don't soften parts of Omaha like they perhaps hoped they would have. But when it comes to the paratrooping and the drop that would have been happening right now, would you consider that a success?
It was a success, and despite a number of pitfalls that they underwent, the main pitfall being is that when a number of the aircraft came under enemy fire, they kind of broke up their formations and they scattered. And accordingly, clusters of paratroopers known as sticks scattered to the wind as a result. And so guys were miles, some 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 miles away from their drop zones. And so that created a little bit of confusion, shall we say. But that confusion was twofold, because the Germans were equally confused, because they didn't know where soldiers were coming from or what units they were from. And so that's something important to keep in mind, that confusion worked to our advantage as well.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, we don't have time to go into all these, but it takes the Germans a very long time to really understand what's happening. And certainly, I mean, at the lower level, they recognize that there's something happening, and those guys sort of forward deployed over on the beach. They know that the invasion is there. They can see this tremendous armada of ships coming at them. They know this is the real thing. It's not a feint. But if you pull yourself back to Rommel and Hitler, it takes them an inordinate amount of time to recognize this is even happening. I mean, all of the subterfuge and the lies that are thrown out there, and the confusion that is purposely created by the Allies, in the end it works. I mean, some of it seems silly, but it actually stuns them into just confusion, and it's a sort of, I also think, sort of speaks to the insane army that Hitler has created, because he's insane, right? I mean, there's no clear command and things like that, right?
Yeah, Hitler took sleeping pills the night before D-Day, and he
Of course he did.
gave orders not to be interrupted, like before like 9 or 10 a.m. in the morning. And so
Right.
despite the invasion being on, his guards are like, shh, the Fuhrer is sleeping. So they certainly didn't help themselves in that regard. But they didn't help themselves in many regards, and that's only one of them.
Yeah.
And he was, high on drugs too, but that too is another story for another time.
Yeah. We'll have to do a separate Zoom on Hitler high on drugs. But yeah, I mean, he, and to the point I was getting at is, he's got Panzer Division that's technically under his control, under his headquarters control, and they can't order them out. They can't counterattack. I mean, the Allies were fortunate that the army that they were going up against, it was battle hardened, but the way in which it was organized was just insane.
Indeed.
So not to do a spoiler here for anyone, but let's jump to the conclusion about D-Day. Let's talk a little bit about what happens and the significance of it all. How did the Allies fare on June 6th? In terms of what they had hoped to accomplish, what they did accomplish? What does June 6th look like if you're, evaluating the outcome of the day's operation?
The best way that I can phrase it is that it was the outcome was perceived as better than expected. And this was especially so in regard to those scattered paratroopers, because one of Eisenhower's air marshals suggested that perhaps 8 out of every 10 of those paratroopers would be killed. And that's one reason why Eisenhower went to visit the 101st Airborne, just a few hours before they took off, is because he undoubtedly probably felt a bit guilty about sending the multitudes to their deaths.
Wow.
And so in the long run, roughly 3 out of every 10 paratroopers are killed. That's still not wonderful by any stretch of the imagination, but it's sure a lot better than losing 80% of them. And so the landings on Utah Beach go quite well, in a matter of hours. The 4th Division and its supplemental units are pushing inland. The troops on the British and Canadian beachheads, your ancestor among them,
right,
are making fairly good headway. Omaha Beach was the one major snag in regard to casualty figures in a singular location. There are about 2,000 casualties that are inflicted upon the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. And there was consideration given as to whether or not, the Omaha operation should be abandoned. Should we pull the troops off the beach? How much is too much? But I think a good way to visualize these opening moments is to picture a conveyor belt, because the conveyor belt keeps going, whether or not troops get stuck on the beach or not. And eventually, things are so congested that there's nowhere to go but forward.
Right.
And so it's really by sheer numbers and force of will on Omaha Beach that headway is made after 8 hours of being stuck there. So imagine that opening half hour of Saving Private Ryan and multiply it by 16. And that is what the duration of Omaha Beach was. Yeah.
And I mean, to your point earlier about how, the Germans might have had, 88s might have been better compared to what the Americans had or the Allies had. But again, the Allies just have these overwhelming numbers. So they're just going to throw these huge numbers in on D-Day. And, even if the losses are big and they're bloody like they are at Omaha, they can just keep pouring them in. And you're right. I mean, it just is sort of just this machine that just kind of takes over, and they just keep driving in more and more troops. They certainly, as the fight goes on and the campaign continues, they're going to get trapped up in the bocage, and it's going to take them a while to get to the breakout. But eventually there is the breakout. I mean, and how long between D-Day and the end of the war? I mean, what are we looking at? How long do the Allies have?
There are about 11 months of combat that continued after D-Day. Long story short, there were hopes of bringing the end of the war about before 1945. That didn't work out as planned.
Right.
And so eventually the war comes to an end mid-May 1945. The Germans surrender in multiple places at multiple times, and depending on whether you ask an American, British, or Russian when the war ends, you'll get a different answer perhaps.
Right, yeah.
But
VE Day is an interesting, moving target.
Yes, indeed.
Well, there's some comments here about just how amazing it was that they thought Normandy was a diversion, that the Germans thought Normandy was a diversion, and that the Pas de Calais was the most heavily armed section of Fortress Europe. No way that the Allies could have succeeded there. It would have been a second Dieppe, only orders of magnitude worse, is what Jan says. And I don't know if you have any response to that or if you would agree.
Oh, yeah. And I'll just elaborate on that a little bit. The Pas de Calais is the shortest stretch between England and France, the shortest stretch of the channel. It's only about 20 or so miles. And so Eisenhower, he kind of turns the tables on the Germans, and he strikes not where they expect him to strike, but at the least expected point. At the broadest part of the channel, on the Cotentin Peninsula, which is about 110 or so miles away from England. And so it was quite the gamble. It was a roll of the dice, but it ended up working out quite magnificently in the long run.
Yeah, it puts a lot of emphasis and a lot of pressure, I guess, on the Neptune component of the operation, the naval component of the operation, which we haven't. We talked about airborne. We've talked about the ground troops, the amphibious assault. Obviously, there's the air assault. There's the naval bombardment. There's the getting them there. I mean, all told, I think the number I've seen is 150,000 Allies engaged in D-Day. Is that a fair figure?
Yes, and many thousand more sailors and Coast Guardsmen, wow. Because the 150,000 is just foot soldiers for the most part. There's about an equal amount of sailors and whatnot on those ships as well. Somewhere in the range then too of 50 to 60,000 German defenders.
Right.
So. It's about 300,000 people. I don't think that even includes the airmen who flew 5,000 individual missions on D-Day and into the next day. 5,000 flights. It's just amazing. Yeah.
And I was going to say, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I'm broadcasting from the office in my house, and our home was built by a D-Day vet, James Stoner, who was a naval medical doctor on board ship, and tended to the wounded that were transported off the beaches back to the ship, and that's where he met in service his wife, who was a nurse in the Navy, and the rest is history. They built the house, and then we bought it a few years ago. So
that's a great
there is D-Day history in the bones of this place, and I'm sure if he were here, he'd have quite a bit to say about the naval component of all.
That's why it looks like a captain's quarters.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. So I guess the bigger question, and so as we draw to a conclusion, if people do have questions, you're welcome to post them. We'll try and answer them. And see another comment here about how from a global perspective, June 5th is also the liberation of Rome, which is true. Mm-hmm. And maybe that kind of takes me to where I'm going here, which is the bigger and perhaps maybe the more challenging question for tonight is, in light of the world that we're living in today, and we mentioned at the beginning, I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and then on top of that, tremendous protests, deservedly so, civil unrest, over systemic racial injustice and the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd. And these are heavy, weighty, times that we're living through that, someday a professor like you is going to be teaching and trying to get students to write about. But in light of this world that we're living in right now, why does D-Day still matter? Why should people still think about it? And maybe I'll pose it to you, and it's a softball for you, but is it still significant? Does it still matter?
In so many ways. And as I was writing this book, and as I've lived the past several years of recent history, the significance of it has only been reinforced in my mind. And, regardless of where you stand politically or ideologically, there are things that we can take from the Second World War to help us get through times like these. One of which is the notion of collective sacrifice. During World War II, citizens very freely and willingly, rationed themselves. They were able to make do with less. Of course, there were exceptions. There were, black marketeers and unsavory folks as such. But, people weren't fighting over toilet paper in 1943 or anything like that. They realized that they were in a common struggle, that fighting amongst each other wasn't going to help anybody but the enemy in the long run. And I've been giving a lot of thought to these sorts of themes about the Second World War and D-Day over these past months in particular, as to how they relate with how society has reacted to the COVID-19 pandemic. Something else too, often in times of hardship, in times of struggle, people tend to come together. And I think we have seen that in many cases since this recent tragedy has unfolded. But then, of course, too, there are other very pronounced instances where that is not the case.
Yeah, I think is it Roosevelt who says, he's maybe in 42, something to the effect that in times of crisis, we learn what this nation is all about.
Yeah.
And I think, you can take that in a couple of different ways. You can take that as, we remember who we are and we dig deep into our ideals. But you can also take it at a moment like we're living through this week in June of 2020 and you say, in times of crisis, we remember what we're all about. And sometimes that's not a pretty thing. So you're right. I mean, crisis does kind of bring out sort of a reality check that maybe otherwise is easy to gloss over,
Yeah, and, I feel too, and I addressed this in the book, we would be remiss if we didn't look over the many shortcomings of what we typically call the greatest generation. We have a very marble, idealized view of them, and in many cases that is rightfully so. But no generation is perfect. History and society evolve. Of course, the military in 1944 was segregated. African American soldiers, in some cases Hispanic soldiers, felt more at home in foreign countries than what they did their own country. And to tie this back in with some interesting Maryland history, about 2 weeks before D-Day, the NAACP held its national conference in Baltimore on May 22nd, 1944. And so things are getting tense in the States because people realize that the invasion's inevitable, that it's coming, that it's on the near horizon. And the keynote speaker at the conference was First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who was far more open-minded and proactive on the notion of civil rights than was her husband. But I'll read to you just a sentence or so of what she said in Baltimore 76 years ago. She said this in reference to Black soldiers who were serving in the military with honor. She said, "We have learned that it is not the color of your skin, your religion, or your race which makes you more able to do certain things better than other people." And certainly, I would hope that those words still ring true. And in many ways, it speaks to the task yet remaining from the World War II era. And it was something very surprising I found in my research, how D-Day, whether we look at civil rights or women's rights or education rights, the GI Bill of Rights comes about just a few weeks after D-Day. All these huge thoughts and emotions and desires on the parts of citizens came to fruition as a result of D-Day, or at least a brick was laid in the foundation of it. And ultimately, it's up to us 3/4 of a century later to determine how we want to build up those additional bricks in the ensuing years.
Yeah, and it's sort of like they made a down payment on some of this, just like you can look at Gettysburg and, what happened there, and the Gettysburg Address that comes after, sort of suggesting that this is an opportunity for this new birth of freedom. But they've paid for this with their lives, so what will you do with it, sort of. And maybe that's the place we leave D-Day tonight, which is the sacrifice of the American soldier in Europe to create a free world, gives us that opportunity to continue that struggle, that the struggle for freedom and security, and that doesn't end on June 7, 1944, or May 8th, 1945, for that matter. It continues on. And we too were a part of that. So speaking of continuing on, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I appreciate all of the people that have joined us. We've had several thousand people reached, and it looks like someone made a nice little donation there too, which is great, which will support the organization. You can pick up Jared's book. We have got a link in the post, but Dispatches of D-Day, fantastic read, great gift for a loved one, and just an all-around good book to have on hand to really get a sense for the human side of this story. Speaking of books and your publishing and what's coming up, if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you? And any sneak peeks of anything you're working on right now?
If folks want to find out more about me and my various books and my research interest, you can go to jaredfrederick.com, and it has links to my various books, artwork, projects, some of the things that I'm involved in. I'm working on a few different projects simultaneous to each other, including my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation, which looks at the history of Gettysburg National Military Park during World War II. So that is one of the things that I am involved in. I'd like to return to the Civil War at some point as well, but as my parents say, I've never been one to be bored, and there'll be many things to come in the future years.
Well, fantastic. Well, we've linked to your book here in the post. We've also linked to your Facebook page, Historian Jared Frederick, so people can follow you there and get your musings on different things as they come up. And then, again, on Amazon, you can pick up all your other books as well, because it's not just this D-Day piece. It has been just a pleasure to be with you tonight. Always fun to chat with you, and a great opportunity to talk about a really momentous event that still matters and still resonates to this day. Jared, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.